Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
He stood as a colossus in the Caribbean, but like the tallest of trees, he was viewed from many vantage points.
Latin America, Africa, Asia, throughout the global south and from Europe itself, the tallest trees catch the strongest winds, of course, and Fidel Castro, who died last weekend at the age of 90, was weather-beaten, but never bowed.
The Cuban Revolution, of which he was the eternal leader, endured almost 60 years of economic siege, subversion, terrorism, even invasion. And 10 US presidents have come and gone since the first made the first attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro. He was a threat to the United States, but not in the way they pretended.
He was the threat of a good example, proof positive that a better world is possible.
Joining us to discuss the legacy of the late Fidel Castro is the director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, Rob Miller. Rob, we both had the great privilege of meeting Fidel many times. What are your lasting memories of his character?
Well, for me, it was a very sad moment when I heard of his death, because for me, Fidel, it really is the epitome of, or the embodiment, sorry, of the Cuban Revolution, not just for the people of Cuba, but for the people of Latin America and the world. Cuba signifies for me an illuminating beacon of hope that a better world is possible. There's a different way of running our society. Societies where people are not left behind, where people have opportunity to achieve, where healthcare is free for everybody, regardless of gender or race or ability to pay. So it was a sad moment for me, and on a very personal level, because of, as you say, I met Fidel a couple of times. He was an incredibly impressive man, but I think it's his legacy that is the impression we're left with.
Sure, the legacy is there and no one can rub it out. But as a character, I mean, for me, he was the greatest man I ever met by a country mile, because he wasn't just a font of wisdom and historical knowledge. After all, he'd seen it all and seen them all. But he was also extraordinarily inquisitive. He wanted to know things from you, as well as tell you things that he knew.
Absolutely. I mean, I felt that he wanted to understand my life in the few minutes that I was with him, because he wanted to know how I, a young man from Britain, had ended up in Cuba. What was my motivation? What was I going to do with the knowledge?
You were a teenager when you first met him.
I was just 15 when I first met him on a World Youth Festival. It was a wonderful moment, and it really moulded my life, really, moving forward from then.
And although you're the only one of that delegation, almost, who's remained faithful, there were some other, now apostates, who met Fidel at the same time as you.
There were some incredible characters on the delegation. Whether they met Fidel, they weren't with me at the time I did, but certainly Peter Mandelson was one of the delegates there as the head, I think, of the British Youth Council at the time. Trevor Phillips was on the delegation, as was Charles Clarke, who later became Home Secretary. So it was quite...
I must go and look for their tributes to the leader. He had... I spent many, many hours with him, because if you were lucky enough to get the summons to come to the Midnight Plus meetings with Fidel, you could be sure they were going to last a long time. And he'd have maps out and charts out, and he'd ask you things that I was embarrassed I was unable to answer. For example, he asked me, what's the total production of oil in the North Sea? And I couldn't have told you to the nearest ocean. And what was the steel production in Britain and so on. He was extremely interested in what the politics were, the economics were in all the countries. I never knew someone with such a global grasp. Mm-hmm. You know, given that Cuba was a poor country, an island in the Caribbean, he knew more about Germany than German politicians.
I think the Western impression and the media impression given of Fidel is this romantic, this vision, this image. But he was a very practical man. Right. His life was about practicalities of bettering the world, of bettering his people. And it's true, when he spoke for so many hours, he told the Cuban people about the different production problems in the different provinces. And he had the minutiae of information there, which could explain to the Cuban people about the process of building and developing their society. And that was incredibly important to him, because I think for the Cuban people, going through such a tough time over so many years, it was important that it was an open and transparent revolution, that everybody could understand exactly what was going right, what was going wrong, and what role everybody in society had to play to take the society forward. So he was incredibly impressive. But then I think the leadership in Cuba has been an impressive leadership, because to survive, as you in your introduction said, 10 US presidents, each of which have led a ferocious assault on that country, from aggression, from violence, assassination attempts, terrorism, a media propaganda war against that island. For that country to survive and still be working towards a better world with a choice that they make, and only the Cuban people have made, to follow that path. The scenes that we're seeing in Havana, and we will see repeated.
Seeing if you look closely on RT.
Absolutely. When you're allowed to see them, it is literally the population of Cuba are out celebrating the man, but also mourning his death, but looking forward to what they can still achieve as a country. There's a real pride in Fidel, but that's because there's a pride in Cuba. Their achievements, all of the Cuban people together as one, standing up proud and firm.
For me, as a believer, there has been divine intervention from the beginning. You'll recall, and people can look it up, it's available on YouTube, Fidel's address in 1959 on the triumph of the revolution. In a crowd of tens of thousands, a white dove descends, and on the potential of 100,000 shoulders it could have landed on, it landed on Fidel's. And I just knew that he was going to go all the way thereafter. But miracles do happen. One of the greatest is Operation Miracle. The Cuban achievements are too long for this program, but tell the viewers about Operation Miracle.
Well, it's a program essentially to treat people across the global south, particularly in Latin America, with cataracts, and it restores their vision. And I myself have been to the Finley Hospital in Havana, and you see people from Bolivia, from Guatemala, from Ecuador walking in, and half an hour later,
walking in blind,
walking out. Amazing, can see. And that operation has now treated, I think it's around 2 million people. And someone said to me, you know, if you're a doctor or you're a scientist and you lose your sight, having that restored can enable you to teach again, can enable you to carry on with your research. So it's a knock-on of helping people realise their own potential, but also to realise the potential of their people. Because the Latin America, Cuba and Latin America, have, over the last 10 or 15 years, began to realise their potential. People are beginning to take control of their resources, their societies, for the benefits of their people. So healthcare, restoration of sight is part of that programme, and it's an incredible achievement for the Cuban doctors to have led that process, now aided, of course, by Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and so on.
I've been quite surprised, I don't know if you were, by the intensity of the ideological aggression over Cuba and Fidel in the British media. I expected it in the Miami Herald, but I didn't quite expect the level of really aggressive lying in much of the British media. What do you think is the reason for that?
It has been a shock, to be honest, because you've had world leaders respecting Fidel, Obama, Kofi Annan, people like Maradona, the footballer, you name it, the Russians, the Chinese. Yeah. Yet our media is still following this vicious, aggressive path. The way I look at it is this: you've had nearly 60 years of aggression, paid for and orchestrated by the United States government. There's an awful lot of dollars, $30 million spent last year alone on promoting regime change in Cuba, with programs inside Cuba and outside of Cuba. And I honestly believe that that promotion, that expenditure, has worked its way into the media, in the United States, but beyond. And I think people have to really question their media yet again, as to say, look at the facts. Why is it that our media is still complicit and part of this outrageous demonisation of 11 million Cubans in the Caribbean who are really just trying to exercise their right to choose and develop their society how they want to develop it? It's a real damning report on our media, to be frank.
It is, and it's been worse in Britain, as far as I can see, than anywhere else in the world, to the extent that you have people lying about torture in Cuba, when any fool knoweth, never mind a journalist, a highly paid and trained journalist, that the only torture there is in Cuba is in the American hellhole called Guantanamo Bay. Tell us about Guantanamo Bay. What is going to happen to that?
Well, the Cuban people want their land back. Guantanamo Bay is the only US base in an occupied land where the people of that country, the government of that country, don't actually want it. It has to be removed. It is illegal. But the US government have made it clear that in the negotiations that they're carrying out under the Obama administration with the Cuban government, that the issue of Guantanamo Bay is not on the table. The fact that they run a prison camp, a torture camp there, is adding insult to injury. And the base really has to go. Steady
as she goes in Cuba. There'll be no possibility of counter-revolution in Cuba. You know that, and I know that. Does the enemy know it?
I think the Obama administration have realised that their policy has failed. They have said so much, that they are the isolated party, and their policy has failed to isolate Cuba. Trump, we shall have to wait and see, but I hope that sensible people will realise that trade and exchange is
tourism,
far better.
Of course.
He'll try and open a Trump Tower in Havana. Trust me on that. Rob Miller, thank you very much indeed for celebrating Fidel Castro on the Sputnik today.
Coming up next, his father was a fascist, at least according to the title of his new book. It's Francis Beckett up next. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Fascism was never so strong in Britain as in the 1930s. Sir Oswald Mosley, a Labour aristocratic swordsman, broke from the party and formed a new one, which morphed into the fully-fledged British Union of Fascists.
The BUF's original hero and financial patron was Mussolini, with a bit of help from Lord Rothermere, whose family still owned the Daily Mail today, and then owned the Daily Mirror too. In time, their hero became Adolf Hitler himself.
Our old friend Francis Beckett, a man of the left himself, has long had to live with the fact that his father was one of Mosley's top lieutenants and one of Britain's leading fascists. He joins us now to discuss his latest book on the matter. A Fascist in the Family, Francis. It's another fantastic piece of work from your long line. You're such a prodigious and brilliant writer, but this must have been a kind of special book to feel you had to write. Why did you feel you had to write it?
Oh, this is the book that's been sitting on my shoulder all my life, demanding to be written, really. And I suppose there were two reasons. My father started out as a socialist after the First World War. He joined the Labour Party. He became a Labour Member of Parliament. He moved to the left, joined the Independent Labour Party, which was the left wing of the party.
The momentum of its day.
Well, I don't know. Well, you and I might have called it the Benites, perhaps. Yes. I don't know. Yes. And gradually, as he became more and more frustrated by the inability of Labour to change the world, he moved further to the left. He created a number of parliamentary scenes. He took the mace in 1930 out of the House of Commons and rushed towards the gentleman's lavatory with the intention of shoving it head down. He was prevented by the police from actually carrying this out. And eventually he was drummed out of Parliament, and that was when his life took a dreadful turn. He joined the British Union of Fascists, he joined Mosley, with the idea so he said at the time, and I think probably believed, that he was really carrying on his socialist activity in another guise. But of course, it soon morphed into straight racism and a thoroughly reactionary general view of the world. He spent the Second World War, most of the Second World War, in prison under the wartime regulation 18B, which allowed the Home Secretary to intern anybody who was considered to be a danger to the war effort, under which Oswald Mosley and others were also interned. After the war, he was really pretty well unemployable. And I thought it was a strange life that ought to be told, and that had been on my mind, really, because he talked fairly freely of it.
I was going to ask you that. Did he explain to you the turn that he had made? Did he ever recant it? Did he have any regrets about it?
Whether he had regrets, I have no idea. He wasn't a man who would like to express regret. I think he was a man for whom expressing regret would have felt like weakness. So if he felt regret, he certainly never said so to me. But he talked a lot about his life. But he talked principally to me about his old parliamentary friends, about Clem Attlee, whom he had been, whose agent he had been before he became a member of Parliament, about Jimmy Maxton, who you will know all about, George, the sort of
Clydeside leader,
the Clydeside leader, to whom he was very close when he was the socialist leader, the leader of the ILP at the end of the 1920s and in the 1930s, to whom he was very personally close.
So how did they respond then to his conversation?
Well, he became a non-person. He became really, as he became more extreme.
Yeah.
His old friends, one by one, dropped out, sometimes initially out of sheer careerism, but later on, because what he was saying was real, what he started to say, what he was saying by 1938, 39, 40, were things that you really couldn't be associated with, things that, I mean, he had started by about the middle of the 30s. He had started to talk about Jews in a way that you just couldn't be associated. You didn't want to know somebody who would speak in that way.
We learn from the book, and I thought I knew this story, that he was himself Jewish.
It's the most extraordinary thing that I never knew when I was a child, this was his most closely guarded secret. And I was just coming on to that as the other reason why I had to write this book. Yeah. This was the most closely guarded secret of his life. I never knew it in his lifetime. I didn't know it until decades after he died. My mother didn't tell me. I don't even know whether she knew or not. I think, I can't tell whether she would have known. But in fact, his mother, whom he was devoted to, was Jewish. Her name, I had always been told that her name was Dorothy Salmon. I now know that her name was actually Eva Solomons, and that she was of a family, a fairly typically 19th century Jewish family. She had been declared dead by her Orthodox relatives for marrying out of the faith and out of Judaism, and as far as I know, never spoke to any of them again from then till the time of her death. But what is clear to me is that she must have known what fascism was, because when he had nothing to do with Mosley and nothing to do with the beginning of the British Union of Fascists, which was just after the fall of the Ramsay-MacDonald government in 1931. He had nothing to do with it. Then one or two Labour MPs did go over to it. Others were tempted. Even Nye Bevan was tempted. But he wasn't one of them. He didn't take any interest in Mosley until 1933. His mother died in 1932. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the key to it, that his mother, whom he had been devoted to, would have been horrified. Even though she had been declared dead, she would have been horrified.
Do you think the other fascists knew?
That's an interesting question, because some of them certainly did know. Some of them knew something was up. When he was interned during the war, and I only learned this from a discussion from among the sort of remnants of the internees. A rumour ran around the internment camp among all the other fascists that his mother had been a Jew. And he denied it absolutely ferociously, so ferociously and with such conviction that the rumour went away. They all stopped saying it. When I first started writing the book, I talked to a Jewish academic called David Englander, who knew quite a lot about my father. And I told him this, and he said, oh, well, that's very interesting because my parents, who were brought up in the East End, they always said that the mother of one of the leading fascists, but they didn't know which one, was Jewish. Wow. So the story was about the East End in one way or another, in a way that I can't now quite put my fingers on.
Yeah. What would have happened, Francis, if they had triumphed, God forbid, if they had come to power in Britain? Would there have been anything distinctively British about their fascism as opposed to Mussolini and Hitler?
I don't think there would have been particularly. It's a very difficult question to answer because they were so far from ever getting anywhere. There was never a moment when it looked as though Mosley might triumph in Britain. It was from about 1932, when there was an initial sort of amount of publicity. It looked like downhill all the way, so it's very difficult to say what a Mosley government would have looked like. But what you can say is that it would not have been run according to a set of principles, because that's not the way of fascism. The way of fascism is that you have to subordinate your ideas and your intellect to those of the charismatic leader, so that it would not really matter what policies a Hitler likes to produce. In fact, detailed policy making was not really what Hitler did, was not really what Mussolini did. The idea is that everybody subordinates their thinking.
To the leader, yeah.
And the most important thing, the most indicative thing that Mosley ever said, when he had left the Labour Party, initially he started something called the New Party, which morphed into the British Union of Fascists. And when it became the British Union of Fascists, he said, I am done with those who think. Henceforth, I shall go with those who feel. And that's what it's about, that you subcontract your thinking, that everybody else subcontracts their thinking to the leader.
Again, God forbid, and thanks to the Red Army and others, it never did. But if the fascists had won the war, Mosley would have presumably been released from the internment camp and put into power as the Gauleiter in Britain.
I don't know what would have happened, and I'm not sure that is what would have happened. It's not what happened in France, after all. Hitler didn't choose Deat and Doriot, the fascist leaders. He chose the right of the old order, Pierre Laval, and the old military hero, Marshal Pétain, to run what remained of the French government. It didn't seem to be Hitler's way to go for the old fascist leader, but to try to draw in as much as he could. So if he could have found a leader from the old parties who would have taken it on, I think he would have preferred it that way. Of course, the other thing to say about if Hitler had won is this, that by then, of course, my father and Oswald Mosley had fallen out ferociously. They were really at daggers drawn. My father claimed that in one interview with the committee that was set up to discuss internment, that he was on Mosley's to-be-shot list. Probably was. All I can say about it is that it's very lucky for both of them that the fascist state they dreamed of never came into existence, because one of them would not have lived to enjoy it.
It is a fantastic book, I must say, and I hope it's a load off your shoulders.
It is, George.
To have written it. Francis Beckett, thanks for joining us
Thank
on
you.
the Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Our social media this week is dedicated to El Comandante Fidel Castro, of course, and Osman Dean says, a man who showed the world there is another way of organizing society and that US imperialism can be beaten. His legacy lives on. And Paco says, Fidel Castro and El Che show that it is not only your basic human right to fight the injustices that enslaves us, but your duty.
Well, a mighty oak has fallen in the forest, that's for sure. We will not look upon his likes again.
No.
For me, he's one of the greatest men that ever walked the earth. He's one of the greatest figures of the 20th century and who lasted into the 21st. Comandante, hasta siempre.
And that's all the tweets that we have for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
But you can stay in touch with us on social media, Twitter, RT_Sputnik, or on Facebook. Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.